Good morning.
Good morning.
It's good to see the snowbirds back. I welcome them myself and express gratitude for those of you that stayed and fought out the winter with us. Easter has been always one of the more difficult Christian holidays for me, especially as it related to my family of origin, because it was a pretty big deal in my family. As active churchgoers, the period of Lent always involved extra midweek services as well as a Good Friday service. As a choir member, I was particularly busy on Easter Sunday. We had to arrive at about 5 a.m. for the sunrise service and remain at church until noon, singing 2 more times. This worship marathon, of course, was fueled by generous helpings of Christmas breakfast food brought by the families of the choir members, including in particular some special sweet crescent rolls that my mom made only on Easter. At home, my parents made almost as big a deal out of Easter as Christmas they did with Christmas, with Easter baskets, with the obligatory colored eggs and jelly beans, and special gifts. And so today I brought some chocolate bunnies and some jelly beans for people back there. Otherwise they don't get them anymore. Our family Easter celebration was thus a combination of the Christian resurrection holiday mixed with a series of other traditions, which, as we shall see, have pagan origins. This tension between pagan and Christian traditions has been a staple of Western Christianity from its earliest days. Now, as time went on for me, Easter posed a number of theological challenges as well. On the one hand, I think we can make a pretty good historical argument that the Good Friday portion of the so-called Passion narrative is probably based on historical fact. I accept what I believe to be the consensus view of biblical scholars, that there indeed was an itinerant preacher and healer from the Galilee during what we now identify as the first century of the Common Era, named Jesus. He was arrested by the Romans for sedition and executed by order of the Roman governor, one Pontius Pilate, a clearly historical figure, possibly at the request of some of the Jewish authorities. Jesus was executed by crucifixion, a gruesome method used by the Romans to deal with political troublemakers. Subject to a few factual inconsistencies in the gospel accounts, I'm willing to accept that the underlying story has more than a kernel of truth. At the same time, I have a lot of problems with the notion of the resurrection, at least as it's traditionally seen. If this event is seen as the resuscitation of the very dead corpse of the executed Jesus, I'm afraid I can't buy into that program. I might be willing to concede that Jesus was such a powerful presence during his lifetime that his followers felt his continuing presence following his death, and that carried over into later written accounts known as the Gospels, which were composed between 70 and 100 years after his death. However, this resurrection, whatever it was, is the seminal development in the so-called Christian movement which arose in the wake of Jesus' death. Now, it's pretty well agreed among scholars that the holiday we now identify as Easter has ancient pagan roots predating the life and death of Jesus. However, there are a number of stories that might form the basis for such a tradition. Stories of saviors who died and were resurrected are commonplace in the ancient Middle East. And a number of these stories were associated with the spring equinox, a time of rebirth after winter. A number of historians, including Helen McDougall and April Holloway, suggest a connection with a number of these ancient tales. For example, Easter is connected by some with the Sumerian myth of Inanna, sometimes known as Ishtar, and her husband Tammuz. This story dates back to at least 2100 before the Common Era. In the story, Tammuz dies and Ishtar, his wife, being grief-stricken, follows him to the underworld where she is killed and hung on display. This causes the earth to lose its fertility. So after 3 days, her assistant goes to the gods for help, and they send 2 creatures to the underworld to spring Ishtar and Tammuz with water, allowing them to return to earth as the light of the sun. Thereafter, Tammuz spends 6 months in the underworld and 6 months on earth, thus creating the cycle of winter death and spring life. So apparently in those days, winter was only 6 months long. Holloway points out that Ishtar and Inanna is also known in some circles as Aphrodite. And the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, where tradition says that Jesus was buried, is built on the site of an ancient temple to Aphrodite. Other scholars identify Easter with the goddess Ostara, who we heard about just before now, and celebrated at the spring equinox as a symbol of renewal and rebirth. According to the German scholar Jakob Grimm, Ostara, or Easter, seems therefore to have been the divinity of the radiant dawn, of upspringing light, a spectacle that brings joy and blessing, whose meaning could easily be adapted by the resurrection day of the Christian God. Some also credit the term Easter to a 7th or 8th century English monk named Bede, who identified the month of April as the month of Easter, or the Paschal month, associated with an ancient goddess named Easter who was celebrated with feasts. Whatever tradition you credit, it seems fairly clear that many of the customs related to Easter have pagan origins, again according to April Holloway. The most widely practiced customs on Easter Sunday relate to the symbol of the rabbit, the infamous Easter bunny, and the egg. As outlined previously, the rabbit was a symbol associated with Easter, representing the beginning of springtime. Likewise, the egg has come to represent spring, fertility, and renewal. In Germanic mythology, it is said that Easter at Ostara healed a wounded bird she found in the woods by changing it into a hare. Still partially a bird, the hare showed its gratitude to the goddess by laying eggs as gifts. The Encyclopedia Britannica clearly explains the pagan traditions associated with the egg. The egg, as a symbol of fertility and a renewed life, goes back to the ancient Egyptians and Persians, who also had the custom of coloring and eating eggs during their spring festival. In ancient Egypt, the egg symbolized the sun, while for the Babylonians, the egg represents the hatching of the Venus Ishtar, who fell from heaven to the Euphrates. While Easter as we know it has its origins in ancient pagan traditions, it has become the central tradition of the Christian liturgical year, and the events of what we now call Easter, as recorded in the Christian Gospels, are the formative events of what has become the Christian religion. While the ethical teachings of Jesus, found primarily in the synoptic Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke, have served as inspirational for Christians and non-Christians alike, the Easter proclamation of Jesus' purported resurrection from the dead has formed the fundamental basis for historic Christianity. Now, the familiar Easter story that we read this morning is from the Gospel of Mark, generally understood to be the earliest of the Gospel accounts found in the Christian Bible. I would note that the reading we had this morning only goes through verse 8. The actual book of Mark in the New Testament contains another 12 verses, the so-called longer ending of Mark. But it's believed that this longer ending is actually a later addition, and that the original book of Mark ended at verse 8. So if you get a chance, take a look at it. At this verse, the women discover the empty tomb, but they're too afraid to tell anyone what they saw, and so they did not, at least at that point, say anything. The longer ending includes Jesus' post-resurrection appearances to his disciples, giving them a version of the so-called Great Commission, and references to speaking in tongues, handling deadly snakes, and the ability to drink deadly things without harm. These are some things that have, in some fundamentalist and charismatic circles, have been passed on. That's really the only place you see it in the New Testament. Now, while Mark contains the earliest gospel account of the resurrection, it is not necessarily the earliest biblical account. That honor probably goes to Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 5, where he says, Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures and was buried. He was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures and appeared to Peter and to the 12. This statement, written about 55 of the Common Era, approximately 2 decades prior to the Gospel of Mark, may represent the earliest creedal statement of what became Christianity. Note many of the similarities of this statement to the Nicene Creed and the Apostles' Creed. Nothing is said of Jesus' ethical teachings, his concern for the poor. Rather, the focus of Paul and later Christianity is on the death and resurrection of Jesus, who they called the Christ, or the Anointed One. Now, there are many, many interesting questions that are raised by the biblical accounts of the last weeks of Jesus' life, and his arrest, trial, execution, and burial. For some provocative analysis of these issues, you might want to look at the writings of Bishop John Shelby Spong, which could be found on his website, a series of essays that he puts out. Those are very interesting, but I'm really not going to spend much time on them today. To me, one of the more interesting questions posed by the Good Friday and Easter accounts has to do with the role of women in the various accounts of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. One of the long-standing disputes in Christianity has been the involvement of women in leadership of various Christian denominations over the centuries, particularly as it relates to the question of ordination into the ministry or the priesthood. While strides have been made in the last few hundred years, even a pope thought of as a progressive has not yet attacked this citadel of male privilege. Now, one of the main justifications for the subordinate role for women is the so-called model of Jesus and his all-male core of disciples. Yet this does not tell the whole story. Among Jesus' female followers were women, including Mary Magdalene, Salome, and Mary, the mother of James. These were women who are identified as accompanying Jesus on his travels and often financially supporting the ministry. And these women are with Jesus until the very end. All of the gospel accounts reflect that Jesus' women followers, in particular Mary Magdalene, were present at the cross. At this time, all of the male disciples had fled, except possibly for the enigmatic disciple who Jesus loved, mentioned only in the Gospel of John, out of fear of the authorities. Only the women remained. And even more striking are the accounts of the event that we call the resurrection. In all of the gospel accounts, it is the women followers who first encounter the empty tomb. While there are slight differences in the different stories, they are consistent that Mary Magdalene is present at the empty tomb on Easter morning. And it is the women who make the Easter proclamation that Jesus is no longer in the tomb, but has been raised from the dead. Now, what is significant about this? Well, in these days of the early first century, as we now call it, women did not hold a very high status. By the time the Gospels were written, the early Christian movement was trying to establish its place in first and second century Palestinian society. While there may have been some conflict, in general, the leaders of the movement were male. Why under these circumstances would the early writers have made up accounts giving a more prominent place to women than actually happened? Would it not have been more likely that the role of women would have, if anything, been underplayed? In fact, in the 6th century, Pope Gregory characterized Mary Magdalene as a prostitute forgiven by Jesus, but most scholars agree that this was an inaccurate and unfair characterization. Now, by the same token, Dan Brown's argument in the Da Vinci Code is probably equally far-fetched. But I think it is fair to say, based on the biblical accounts, that Mary Magdalene was clearly a major figure in the Jesus movement that arose during his lifetime and after his death. And in fact, a very interesting book is called The Gospel of Mary Magdalene. And it shows this conflict between Mary Magdalene and Peter for leadership of the early movement. Fascinating, it's a relatively short read, but a fascinating piece. Now, this interpretation of the biblical Easter stories may be of more than mere academic or scholarly interest. Given the power of organized Christian religion in this country, particularly that of a more conservative or traditionalist variety, the issue of what the Bible really teaches about the appropriate role of women in the church may have long-term ramifications regarding the role of women, both in and out of the church and in both the United States and other parts of the world where Christianity holds sway. As I said, Easter has presented a challenge for me. Since our kids have grown up and our grandchildren live far away, we've pretty much avoided celebrating Easter, unless I'm able to score a few jelly beans from friends and family who celebrate the holiday in the traditional pagan sense. But I do think that it reminds us of a few things that are worth considering. First of all, it's good to be in touch with the earth and the cycle of the seasons. In a few weeks, we'll celebrate Earth Day, where we are reminded of our connection to our planetary home and our obligation to care for it. We modern urban types can find it too easy to get lost in our big screen televisions, our iPads, phones, and other devices, particularly during the Final Four, and forget it as the simple things of Earth that are meaningful to us. As spring really finally comes, let us appreciate the return of the sun and the greening of the environment. Second, let us remember the importance of resurrection in our own lives. I'm not talking about rising from the dead or retaining eternal life. The answers to those questions are above my pay grade. But I'm sure that we all have had times of deep despair in our lives that we thought would never go away. The Good Friday Easter story, seen allegorically, reminds us that from the deepest depths of despair and loss, our own personal Good Fridays, if you will, an Easter Sunday resurrection of renewal can come. We simply need to be open to it. And finally, let us remember the importance of those people who have been our guides and role models, even if they are no longer physically with us. As I said earlier, I have no idea what the actual resurrection experience was, but it would not surprise me if it had something to do with the impact that Jesus had on his followers for his death. 47 years ago yesterday, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis. While the murderer's bullet took the King's physical life away from us, the extraordinary spirit of his character continues to have its impact almost a half century later. Might we suggest in that sense that he was raised from the dead as well and remains with us still? I wish you all a blessed and happy equinox, Passover, and Easter. And now maybe we can take a few minutes to talk about some of these ideas.